The date is April 1st, 1990. The Skydome in Toronto, Ontario, a colossus of concrete and steel, trembles under the weight of over 67,000 screaming fans. WrestleMania IV, the ultimate challenge, is upon us. A clash of titans that, in retrospect, feels less like a wrestling match and more like a pivotal, almost prophetic moment in the annals of sports entertainment. The air crackles with an almost palpable electricity, a tension woven from the fervent hopes of millions. Hulk Hogan, draped in yellow and red, his pythons flexed, represents the established order, the past, present, and foreseeable future of the World Wrestling Federation. But then the unmistakable strains of a primal drumbeat shatter the stadium's composure, and a burst of vibrant color explodes from the entrance ramp. He sprints, a blur of neon tassels and rippling musculature, his face a mask of primal intensity, his movements a symphony of unbridled energy. The ultimate warrior. He seizes the top rope, shaking it with such ferocity that it seems poised to snap. His eyes wide with a maniacal gleam, his body vibrating with an almost alien power. He is the antithesis of Hogan's controlled charisma, a whirlwind of pure, unadulterated passion. And for a fleeting, glorious moment, as he stares down the seemingly invincible Hulkster, it feels as though the very fabric of the Federation is about to be ripped apart. The baton, it seems, is about to be passed. A new era, one of untamed ferocity and kaleidoscopic fury, is on the horizon. The crowd is on its feet, a roaring tide of humanity swept up in the magnetic pull of this extraordinary spectacle. When the final bell rings and the Ultimate Warrior stands triumphant, both the Federation Championship and the Intercontinental Championship clutched in his hands. The message is clear: the future has arrived, and it is painted in the chaotic hues of the warrior. Yet despite this monumental victory, despite the seemingly limitless potential radiating from this singular figure, the trajectory of his Federation run, far from ascending to the predicted stratospheric heights, would instead plummet with a bewildering, almost tragic rapidity. Why? The answer, as is often the case with such meteoric rises and precipitous falls, is multifaceted, a complex interplay of personal demons, shifting industry tides, and an irreconcilable clash between an enigmatic personality and the rigid machinations of a burgeoning empire. To understand the precipitous decline, one must first trace the meteoric ascent. James Bryan Hellwig, the man who would become the Ultimate Warrior, was not a product of the traditional wrestling territories. His journey was a decidedly unconventional one, beginning not in dingy gymnasiums or dusty independent circuits, but in the world of bodybuilding. This origin, though seemingly innocuous, is critical. The bodybuilding aesthetic, particularly in the late 1980s, was increasingly intertwined with the growing use of anabolic steroids. Hellwig, a man perpetually striving for an almost superhuman physique, found himself immersed in this culture. The visual impact of the warrior was undeniably rooted in his extraordinary musculature, a physique that, while impressive, would later become a source of intense scrutiny and, ultimately, a significant impediment to his longevity. The Federation, under Vince McMahon's shrewd and increasingly aggressive leadership, was moving away from the gritty regional wrestling scene towards a polished, cartoonish spectacle, and the larger-than-life characters were paramount. Hellwig's raw physical presence, coupled with his unrefined charisma, caught the eye of McMahon, a man with an uncanny ability to spot potential, even if it was buried beneath layers of unorthodoxy. Before his arrival in the Federation, Hellwig honed his craft, or perhaps more accurately, developed his persona, in various smaller promotions. He was part of a tag team known as the Blade Runners with Steve Borden, who would later achieve fame as Sting. Even then, the seeds of his future character were apparent: intense, visually striking, and somewhat enigmatic. When he finally arrived in the Federation in late 1987, he was initially presented as Dingo Warrior, a somewhat generic, albeit powerful figure. However, McMahon, ever the visionary, saw something more. He saw the potential for a character that transcended the conventional, a being of pure, unadulterated aggression and enigmatic power. Thus, the Ultimate Warrior was born, a name that perfectly encapsulated the hyperbolic, larger-than-life essence of the new era. His promos were a masterclass in controlled chaos, a torrent of unintelligible, yet undeniably compelling pronouncements. He spoke in riddles, his eyes bulging, his voice a gravelly roar, his entire being vibrating with an almost alien energy. It was illogical, nonsensical even, yet it resonated profoundly with audiences, particularly younger ones, who were drawn to the sheer spectacle and unbridled intensity. The ascent was swift and seemingly unstoppable. He quickly captured the Intercontinental Championship, a title he held with a firm grip, defending it with a relentless ferocity that further cemented his status as a force to be reckoned with. The fans adored him, their adoration fueled by his unique presentation, his boundless energy, and his unwavering intensity. He was a breath of fresh air in a landscape that, while dominated by Hogan, was beginning to feel a touch predictable. The stage was set for WrestleMania VI, the ultimate confrontation, a passing of the torch that felt both inevitable and deeply symbolic. And for a brief shining moment, it seemed that the Ultimate Warrior was indeed the undisputed future of the Federation. He defeated Hogan cleanly, a rare feat, and stood tall, the undisputed top dog. The world, or at least the wrestling world, was his. However, the very qualities that propelled him to superstardom, his intensity, his enigmatic nature, his unwavering self-belief, would ultimately contribute to his undoing. The first, and perhaps most significant factor, was his increasingly strained relationship with management, particularly Vince McMahon. Hellwig was notoriously difficult to work with. He possessed an unshakable belief in his own worth, a conviction that often bordered on obstinacy. He saw himself as an artist, a visionary, and he chafed under the constraints of a corporate structure that demanded conformity and adherence to a meticulously crafted script. He often arrived late to events, was unwilling to compromise on his character's presentation, and was prone to making demands that McMahon, a man who built an empire on absolute control, found unacceptable. This friction, initially minor, began to fester, eroding the trust and goodwill that had once existed between the two men. The issue of money became a recurring flashpoint. As the top champion, Hellwig believed he was not being adequately compensated for his contributions, particularly in comparison to Hogan, who had enjoyed a longer, more lucrative reign. He felt that he was carrying the company on his back, and his perceived financial undervaluation fueled his resentment. This led to numerous disputes, some of which escalated into open confrontations. One particularly infamous incident occurred prior to SummerSlam 1991, where Hellwig, feeling aggrieved by his pay, threatened to boycott the event. McMahon, in a calculated move to maintain control and avoid public embarrassment, reluctantly acquiesced to some of his demands, but not before sending him a strongly worded letter outlining his profound disappointment and the disciplinary actions that would be taken. This letter, which later became public, served as a stark illustration of the deep chasm that had opened between the two. Then there was the undeniable presence of ego. Hellwig's self-belief, once a driving force, began to morph into an almost debilitating egomania. He truly believed he was the ultimate warrior, not merely portraying the character. This blurring of lines between man and persona, while undoubtedly contributing to the authenticity of his performances, made him increasingly difficult to manage. He was resistant to creative direction, often improvising his promos and matches, much to the chagrin of producers and fellow wrestlers who sought a more structured approach. His unpredictable nature, once thrilling, became a liability, hindering the seamless execution of storylines and hindering the development of other talent around him. He saw himself as above the established norms, operating on a different plane, and this often led to conflicts with colleagues who viewed him as unprofessional and self-serving. The shadow of steroids, a pervasive issue in professional wrestling during that era, also loomed large. The drastic fluctuations in his physique, coupled with anecdotal evidence from those within the industry, painted a clear picture. The physical toll of such substances, combined with the rigorous schedule of a professional wrestler, undoubtedly contributed to his erratic behavior and health issues. Moreover, as public awareness and scrutiny of steroid use grew, particularly after the infamous McMahon steroid trial in the mid-1990s, the Federation began to distance itself from overtly muscular physiques. The shift towards a more toned-down athletic aesthetic meant that the Warrior's highly stylized, hypermuscular look became increasingly out of step with the company's evolving image. the underlying ethical and health concerns surrounding steroid use increasingly began bubbling to the surface, subtly influencing booking decisions and the perceived longevity of certain performers. The departure of Hulk Hogan, his primary rival and the undisputed king of the Federation for so long, also played an unexpected role in the Warrior's decline. Hogan's departure created a void, but it was a void that the Warrior, for all his charisma and power, was ultimately unable to fill. Hogan possessed a unique ability to connect with a mass audience, to transcend the wrestling world and become a pop culture icon. The Warrior, while captivating, lacked Hogan's broad appeal and his innate understanding of how to be a corporate ambassador. He was a force of nature, but not a malleable one. McMahon, realizing that the Warrior was not the long-term dependable face of the company he envisioned, began to look for alternatives, ultimately finding his next megastar in Bret the Hitman Hart, a wrestler who, while less physically imposing, possessed a more traditional wrestling skill set and a far more professional demeanor. The final straw often came down to one crucial element: reliability. In the demanding world of professional wrestling, particularly during the grueling travel schedules of the Federation, reliability was paramount. Promoters and agents needed performers who would show up on time, perform as expected, and adhere to the planned itinerary. The Warrior's erratic attendance, his unpredictable moods, and his frequent disagreements with management made him a constant source of anxiety. He became a liability, a risk that McMahon, ever the pragmatist, was increasingly unwilling to bear. The cost of his unpredictable behavior, both financially and in terms of backstage morale, began to outweigh the perceived benefit of his star power. His departures and returns became a frustratingly cyclical pattern. After the SummerSlam 1991 incident, he was suspended indefinitely, only to return sporadically. The magic that once surrounded him began to fade, tainted by the lingering impression of his unreliability. The audience, too, began to grow weary of the constant cycle of his presence and absence. The Ultimate Warrior character, once an enigma, began to feel like a broken record, a tantalizing promise that was never fully delivered upon. The 1990s, particularly the latter half, saw a dramatic shift in the professional wrestling landscape. The new generation gave way to the edgier, more adult-oriented Attitude Era. Characters became more nuanced, storylines more complex, and the emphasis shifted from cartoonish superheroes to anti-heroes and morally ambiguous figures. The Ultimate Warrior, a remnant of a bygone era, struggled to adapt. His monochromatic character, once his greatest asset, became his greatest limitation. There was no room for introspection, no space for character development within the rigid confines of his persona. He was what he was, and in a rapidly evolving industry, that simply wasn't enough. Ultimately, the story of the Ultimate Warrior's precipitous decline is a cautionary tale, a complex narrative of immense talent clashing with an equally immense personality, all set against the backdrop of a rapidly changing industry. He was a supernova, burning blindingly bright for a brief, glorious period, only to fizzle out with unexpected speed. His impact, however, remains undeniable. For a fleeting moment, he was the heir apparent, the embodiment of a new, wilder frontier in sports entertainment. But the very fire that fueled his ascension also consumed him, leaving behind a legacy of both breathtaking spectacle and unfulfilled potential. His battles extended beyond the squared circle, fought not just against his opponents, but against management, against himself, and against the relentless march of time. The reasons for his fall were not singular, but a confluence of factors: a fiercely independent spirit clashing with corporate demands, a battle with personal demons and an insatiable ego, and a character that, for all its magnetism, proved too rigid to adapt to the shifting tides of an unforgiving industry. The ultimate challenge, it seems, was not in defeating Hulk Hogan, but in navigating the treacherous currents of fame, power, and personal ambition within the confines of a burgeoning entertainment empire. And in that challenge, despite his initial triumph, the Ultimate Warrior's Federation run, for all its electrifying moments, ultimately fractured and fell apart with a speed that left fans and industry insiders alike bewildered.